Something that I want to focus on for the time being is care work. We've been hearing a lot about care work lately, for a while, but especially lately during the pandemic. I think that one of the many things that the ongoing pandemic obviously threw into sharp relief is how deeply dysfunctional our system of caregiving in the US is. So as we know, overcrowded and understaffed nursing homes were very early sites of COVID outbreaks. They now account for over a third of all COVID deaths in the US.
Tonight, nursing homes across the country scrambling to increase safety protocols.
It started going south immediately, simply because of staffing shortages and a lack of protective equipment. Certified nursing assistants started contacting us for any type of advice or guidance, and the fear grew very quickly. Can we get masks? Should I go to work? Should I quit? How do I protect myself? Are we getting the truth?
We started literally with a spreadsheet. No one else was tracking this at a national level at that point. We went to every state, we filed public records requests asking to confirm the numbers of cases and deaths.
With nursing homes, there's a level of complexity. We were sending out supplies, we were giving them testing guidance, but what we found a lot of times was that the staff didn't understand exactly how to use the protective equipment.
Sometimes you would get things that didn't even resemble PPE. One of our members received condoms from FEMA as PPE. Frankly, nursing homes were treated less than hospitals. We were the stepchild, so to speak, of healthcare, and we didn't get the PPE first. We didn't get the information, the testing that was needed in any infection, pandemic or not.
So in addition to that, as COVID cases surged and ICUs were stretched to capacity last year, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare professionals, already beset by a nursing shortage even prior to the pandemic, faced high levels of burnout.
For more than a decade, Joanna Engman loved bedside nursing.
It was a true calling. I wanted to be at the bedside of the sick, the dying.
But last year, when the pandemic hit, the Colorado nurses' love of nursing was tested.
And you're seeing someone who is scared and suffering, and you're not able to be present with them because you're so overworked. You either numb out or you are crying.
In February, weary of a lack of PPE and grueling schedules, Joanna left bedside nursing. She's not alone. According to a recent Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation poll, 3 in 10 healthcare workers have weighed leaving the profession, and 6 in 10 say the pandemic burned them out. In hard-hit New York, there was a 400% increase in nurses looking for new jobs. And a recent Yale School of Public Health survey finds a quarter of healthcare workers are showing signs of PTSD.
Then, on top of that, of course, last year's school and daycare closures put many parents, particularly women, in the bind of navigating 24/7 childcare while simultaneously trying to work their jobs either remotely or in person.
My husband and I have not had childcare since the pandemic started.
We're now, I think, in day 110, but he's counting.
All across America, working parents on the brink.
It's causing me a lot of anxiety trying to figure out how I'm going to sustain it.
Should I keep working or should I stop and be with my children? Because I just can't give them my full undivided attention that they deserve.
The pandemic has shuttered schools, summer camps, sidelined virus-vulnerable grandparents. The result, some 18 million Americans have no one to care for their young kids.
How tired are you?
Pretty tired.
This caregiving squeeze from all directions understandably prompted many progressives to renew a conversation on the value of caregiving, both waged and unwaged. How might this year have looked different had the work we do to care for one another, ourselves, and the world around us been valued at a premium? The New York Times asked in February. Likewise, in the spring, the Biden administration met with policy experts to discuss an infrastructure package, and according to the Washington Post, several prominent progressive economists advised the White House that, quote, federal investments in care work would do more to generate jobs and economic growth than physical infrastructure. Others argued that because care workers were disproportionately women of color, focusing on infrastructure indicated a kind of gender and racial bias. As the Post reported, quote, "Some people close to the White House say that they feel that the emphasis on major physical infrastructure investments reflects a dated nostalgia for a kind of white working class male worker." And over at the New York Times, author Gabriel Winant made a similar argument for prioritizing care work over manufacturing, writing, quote, "While there are many projects that require blue-collar work, there's little reason to treat such employment as an end in itself. In the long view, it seems not to be a category of labor for which our economy generates consistent demand." So, is care work the future of work, and by extension, the future of the labor movement? First of all, we have to be clear that, quote, "care work is a large and often amorphous category that encompasses a huge variety of workers with vastly different work conditions and relationships to their employers. Some care workers, such as nurses, receive quite a lot of training and education and are highly unionized compared to the general workforce. On the other hand, other care workers, such as nannies, home care aides, and house cleaners, usually lack a traditional shop floor, let alone a stable employer, earn extremely low wages, often without benefits, and don't even have collective bargaining rights under federal labor law. It's this precarious and low-wage end of the care work spectrum that's growing the most rapidly. For instance, the economy is projected to add over 1 million new home care aide jobs by 2026. And again, these jobs are very often hazardous, poorly compensated, and disproportionately staffed by immigrants and women of color. So that's all to say that I agree that we need major federal investments in caregiving. Not only do we need programs like universal childcare and universal elder care, but we need the government to ensure that these jobs are safe, well compensated, and unionized. What I reject, however, is the idea that we need to dismiss manufacturing or so-called blue-collar work in order to make care work jobs good. Something that we've criticized on the show before is occupational destiny, which is the belief that certain types of jobs are vanishing and never coming back, and that attempting to save these jobs is at best futile and at worst just a way of pandering to long-gone white male hard hats. In fact, one reason why the left absolutely has to concern itself with manufacturing and other blue-collar sectors in addition to care work is that they all function as different points of leverage against capital. Workers in manufacturing and industrial sectors are still capable of large disruptive strikes that can shut down a significant portion of the economy. Even though manufacturing jobs may not be as plentiful as they were 50 years ago, manufacturing still generated over $2 trillion in wealth in 2021. On the other hand, care work is crucial, not simply because it creates profits for employers, though unfortunately under our current privatized healthcare system, it does, but also because it plays a central role in keeping society functioning. Now, ironically, our deep societal dependence on care work means that it's often much harder for care workers to strike. For example, when nurses at a for-profit hospital go on strike, it doesn't just hurt their employer's bottom line, it also has potential consequences for patients. This is why nurses actually pretty rarely undertake open-ended strikes and almost never simply walk out with no warning. Yesterday, I spoke briefly with Marlena Pellegrino, who's an RN at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, about this very issue. Just for some background, over 700 nurses at St. Vincent have been on a very rare open-ended strike since March of this year. Take a look.
They've been on the picket line since March 8th, and now the nurses at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester have hit a milestone they never wanted to reach, 100 days on strike.
It's just exhausting and, frustrating, and we just want to come to ultimately a compromise.
No one's out here because it's fun. We're out here for the patients. We're out here to stand up for people that can't stand up for themselves.
The more than 700 nurses walked off the job for what they call unsafe staffing levels inside the hospital. St. Vincent, which is owned by Tenet Healthcare, a Dallas-based company, announced last month they plan on hiring permanent replacements.
Nurses have stepped up and said, we're not going back in that building for the status quo, where we remain caring for too many patients at one time, putting patients' lives in jeopardy every shift, every day.
The nurses say Tenet has refused to come back to the negotiating table despite calls from local and state leaders. And while the financial and emotional strain has been difficult for those on the picket line, they say that hardship has only made them stronger and more dedicated to their cause.
We're from Central Mass. We're people from Worcester. Are you kidding me? Of course we're going to put up a fight.
We're not going anywhere. We're out here for one day longer than they are.
Since that news segment aired in June, the strike has continued, which now makes it the longest nurses' strike in Massachusetts history. Last week, the union and Tenet Healthcare, which again is the corporation that owns St. Vincent Hospital, were close to reaching an agreement to end the strike. Unfortunately, at the last minute, Tenet scuttled the deal by refusing to guarantee that all striking nurses would be able to return to their previous positions, shifts, and hours. As Marlena Pellegrino put it, this was a punitive move against the striking nurses who had worked at the hospital for decades, and as she put it, quote, union busting at the highest level. According to a statement by the nurses union, to date, Tenet Healthcare has spent more than $100 million to force and prolong the strike, while at the same time purposefully closing beds and services, deliberately using the suffering of sick patients in Worcester as leverage against the striking nurses. So it's pretty clear at this point that it's Tenet, of course, and not the nurses who are putting patients at risk. After all, recall that the nurses went on strike in the first place because of unsafe staffing ratios, among other issues. At the same time, when I talked to Marlena, she made the point that nurses do not take strikes lightly precisely because they know how crucial their work is and because of their relationships with patients. As Marlena explained it, the St. Vincent Hospital strike was nearly 3 years in the making. She told me, quote, there are more nursing strikes now than there used to be, but a nursing strike is still a very unusual occurrence. We used every single avenue we could to avoid this strike. It's not like you can mobilize 700 nurses to go out on strike in a month.
Really been trying to negotiate with this administration for close to 3 years now. We worked through a pandemic where they furloughed our nurses. They sent nurses home in the middle of shifts. We worked short-staffed during the pandemic, not because we didn't have nurses, because they decided to keep those nurses home to save money. It's PPE. So it stemmed from there. Before the pandemic, we were negotiating about staffing. We filled out close to 600 or 700 unsafe staffing reports. We had multiple negotiation sessions, meetings. We had informational pickets. We did standouts. We wore buttons. We signed petitions. We had monthly meetings with our upper administration. We had one-on-one meetings with them. We took a no confidence vote in our CEO and chief nursing officer. I think it's going to be over a year ago now. 14 months or maybe more. All of these actions, we did this all while working short-staffed, all while our patients were having more falls. We were caring for too many patients at one time, and not because there weren't nurses to be had, not because this company didn't have any money, because they just said, no, you're not having more staff.
So Marlena continued, after 3 years of doing that, after all of that negotiating, when it came to this point, the union gave the hospital a 10-day notice. We don't just walk out of the building. We don't just walk out on our patients. It's a heart-wrenching decision to begin with. So all of this is to say that the very nature of care work means that nurses and other care workers are often up against constraints that industrial workers just don't have. Care workers are essential because they so often make the difference between life or death for the people who rely on them. We depend on them for our basic human needs. But the strength of the labor movement also depends on industries that are positioned to directly hit capital where it hurts the most. That is, by eating into profits and imposing new costs on business. Here's how economist and former trade unionist Howard Botwinick described the relationship between labor and capital during the New Deal. He writes, unions were only able to get these giant corporations to take them seriously at the bargaining table because thousands of militant workers had developed the ability to impose significant costs on those firms if they refused to take them seriously. Through the effective use of mass picket lines during strikes, sit-downs, slowdowns, boycotts, and other creative tactics, those militant CIO unions forced their employers to weigh the relative costs of allowing wages and conditions to gradually improve versus the alternative costs of fighting a prolonged battle with their unions. And, as in other competitive choices facing firms, employers were compelled to adopt the option that would hopefully minimize their overall costs. In effect, the CIO found a way to turn the forces of competition against their employers. In other words, if the left is serious about rebuilding a labor movement that has the capacity to confront capital and win gains for all of the working class, we can't indulge in occupational destiny or inadvertently fetishize so-called pink-collar work simply because we don't want to seem like we're fetishizing blue-collar work. The future of the labor movement is care work. It's also infrastructure, manufacturing, clean energy, transportation, communications, and more. The point of building a vibrant labor movement, after all, is not to predict what will happen to jobs in the future, but to at least try to have some hand in actively shaping that future ourselves.
It's really interesting with nursing, because even before COVID, they were actually one of the fastest unionizing sectors in the economy. And I think COVID is going to accelerate that. We're even seeing in the Philadelphia area, a bunch of new hospitals nurses are trying to organize. And actually, my first strike I was involved in as a student, my freshman year at Temple University, was the Temple Hospital Nurses Strike. And I remember what really actually kind of was profound for me was discovering that they were actually striking over safe staffing ratios. And I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about for the common good.
Yep.
And they're actually fighting very hard legislatively in states and federally to get safe staffing mandates. But yeah, I mean, I think kind of going along with what you were saying, part of just a little bit annoyance of the way people are talking about care work is not that, of course, care work is not important or that it's a growing sector, but it's like almost pitched as is either or like somehow it's like strangely more woke to be for care work than other things. So yeah, it's almost like a weird dividing up the workforce kind of strategy that we shouldn't really be using.
So it'll shock no one to realize that the left can have a problem with walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? And I think that this is a perfect example. Like as obvious, almost ridiculously obvious as it may seem, it does always bear repeating when we get into these kind of back and forth debates. Is like, this is a big freaking country, right? There are a lot of different workers there, working in lots of different types of conditions, right? You know, it can't be either or. It's never either or. It was never ever going to be either or, right? We have to be able to take that kind of complexity for what it is, right, and think about the totality of it all. And I think that when we talk about care work as the future, I think that one really interesting facet of that conversation that I'd be curious to hear you guys' thoughts on is like, because when we talk about manufacturing not coming back, right, it's kind of because we are always locked into this sort of capitalist paradigm of understanding the possibilities of history, right? That the only types of jobs that can be created, and we'll stick with this country, right? The only types of jobs that can come about, that can be created, are ones that serve kind of the profit-making needs of, you know, the business class, what have you, right? And so, you know, it can often, there's so many ways that people can be gainfully employed. There's so many ways that they can be paid for that work, so many productive ends that we can like direct that labor towards that never even enter into our imagination, you know, like as a viable economic possibility for the working class to live a comfortable, dignified life. It's only like, you know, what options, again, does that flexible market kind of create for us? You know, care work could be an example of how it's like, well, yeah, it's care. It's something human beings do for one another, right? It is one of the most vital and essential kind of labor, forms of labor that we have ever provided one another. It doesn't have to be kind of roped into this awful system of profit. But companies like Tenet have certainly like made it so, right? And they show what that question of rigidity and flexibility means, right? Tenet is doing what Reagan did. It throws money at the problem, and it says, you ungrateful bastards didn't want to take that. And the workers are saying, because it's not just about the money, right? Like having a 4-to-1 nurse to patient ratio is what Alan Greenspan would call a rigidity, right? It is something, it is a backstop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And they don't want that. They want to just say, like, no, we need you to be quote unquote flexible so that we can basically tell you how many patients you're going to have on any given day to like work within this model that we have created, which is a, you know, horrifying and terrible way to run healthcare.
I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this aspect of striking, because when I was talking to Marlena, by the way, I just want to shout out the ongoing St. Vincent Hospital strike.
Yeah.
Like I said, like they have been on strike for almost 6 months now. When the RN I talked to, Marlena, is incredible. I think she said that she's been working at St. Vincent for over 2 decades. A lot of the nurses have been at the hospital for decades. And, if I didn't make this clear during the segment, they really are fighting not just for better working conditions for themselves, but obviously for their patients as well. And the reason why I wanted to incorporate Marlena's discussion of what it took to get to the point of striking is just to show how ruthless and callous this company Tenet Healthcare is, and how the nurses, I think that we often see management trying to weaponize with nurses strikes or even teacher strikes, the fact that there are patients or students who, can't be going to school or who aren't getting care. But something that, Paul, you were saying that I think comes through really clearly in this particular strike is that these nurses were very, very open about how they were foregrounding their patients' safety. And that's really what is on the line. I mean, and it's true. And actually, I'll just repeat, Tenet Healthcare is in a position to end the strike now, but they're being incredibly vindictive. So anyway, that's just wanted to throw that out there. But to go back to sort of the original question, I do really think that healthcare workers and, in many cases, teachers are in a very tough position when it comes to striking. And I think that, that is inherent to the nature of their work. Obviously, people don't go into nursing if they don't like to help people. Nurses and teachers build relationships with their patients and students. It's much more difficult, I think, for a nurse to walk off the job than it is for, a Nabisco worker to decide that they're not going to package Oreos for the day. Shout out to Nando's segment from last weekend. If you didn't see it, catch it. But anyway, I guess I'm wondering what you guys make of that, because I think, although obviously, as we've seen with the St. Vincent strike, that can be overcome when conditions become bad enough. I do think that is something that makes care work a much more difficult sector to, it's not that they're not militant, but it just makes it a much more difficult sector to directly confront capital, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what I might say is on the flip side of that, I think it makes it more difficult initially to strike, but I think the flip side is that those strikes actually are so much more powerful politically when done right, and of course this is nothing to shoot down any strikes in the private sector, but the Chicago teacher strike, the LA teacher were so powerful because they were, involved the broader community. And I think, for leftists, these are interesting fights because it's a broader class-wide fight. So it's yes, the teachers on strike, but we're fighting for these services that the working class of this city depends on. And if you can mobilize on that basis, it's a broader class-wide fight than kind of you said, these particular workers at this factory are fighting. And yes, we know that, improving their conditions will help improve everyone, but there's less of that direct connection. So yeah, I think it's harder, but I think when it happens in the public sector, it could be more powerful in certain ways. And I think it's the kind of thing where the more these unions learn how to do it in the right way, I think the better they'll get at it. But again, of course, it's not to say that we don't need strikes in the private sector. Of course we do.
I just feel like I've seen so many instances of strikes where management does successfully rally the public against teachers or against, nurses or people in a position of, care or who have students or patients. I think that you're right, that it does seem like since at least the Chicago teachers strike, the managers and the right wing have been a little less effective at doing that. I noticed that there was a lot of that during the pandemic, where you had a lot of Republicans and even Democrats, saying things like the teachers are, they're basically locking your kids out of school because the teachers unions don't want the teachers to go back to work. Parents, you should be really mad about this. And maybe they were a little successful at kind of ginning up resentment, but I think for the most part, lots of parents and, thanks to, of course, the work done by teachers unions in kind of this bargaining for the common good model and just, community outreach, we're able to deflect that narrative. But Max, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I know that in the previous kind of segment, I talked about my own conservative upbringing. This is all very familiar to me. I remember
You've heard the arguments?
I've heard it, I felt it, I thought it. I mean, I remember when some of my own teachers, went on strike.
Mhm.
It was a brief time. It was a limited sort of action at designated points in the day, but that was my immediate response. And it was this response that I heard so many other parents and students talking about is like, like Reagan said in that kind of infamous speech in the Rose Garden about the Petco strike. He said, you took an oath, right? He invokes kind of the solemnness of like that oath to public service,
Mhm.
right? That means that, if you go on strike, right? If you exercise, labor's greatest power, to get what it needs, then you are in fact kind of violating that oath. You are forsaking the people who are depending on that labor. And that was always a very effective way to turn me and so many others, against teachers like that. And I think that one thing that is really important and a potential sign, a hopeful sign, right, is, again, when I think about the decade and a half, or the 2 decades, I suppose, after Reagan, right, leading up to the financial crash, right, it was in that period that the ruling class's fictions and fables like had some sort of purchase for a lot of us, because the dream of attaining a middle class like life, or even more than that. Reagan famously said that I want to live in America where people can get rich and stay rich, right? You don't hear Republicans saying that crap anymore because they've all acknowledged that it's not going to happen, right? The billionaire class has been set. It's their world. We're all just living in it. They don't even try to sell you on that belief that you're going to be one of the chosen few who makes it to that level of riches and opulence. That's gone out the window. But in the 90s and early 2000s, I think that kind of economic, those economic conditions were such that people still felt that they could attain that life and that they could and should approach society through the lens of consumers, right? That it was always, what have you done for me? Like, what can I get out of this? What are you supposed to give me as your job tells you to do? Again, I think that the ruling class can't help itself. The more that it breaks our ability to live in a less than precarious way, the more that it takes all that stuff away from us, the less compelling it is for us to go about all the kind of interactions in our life thinking, well, I'm paying my hard-earned dollars for this or that cash and you owe this to me, because most of us can't pay for it, right? Because most of us can't attain that, right? Or because most of us are working our asses off in 1, 2, or 3 jobs, and we identify more with each other as workers than as consumers. So if you don't have that possibility of attaining that sort of comfortable existence in an economy that is moderately workable for a vast amount of people, that sort of capitalist fiction really breaks down. And where we can really seize on that is kind of build bonds of solidarity among us.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.